Good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of your conference this weekend. My name is Marisol Jimenez. I live in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina. Yeah, I've seen a lot of neighbors here this weekend. I'm incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you all tonight, and also to be a part of what I'm learning is a really incredible legacy of Presbyterian women and your role in justice work and in making this world truly better. My mother is the youngest daughter of 8 Irish immigrant children, a working class family. My grandparents came here through Ellis Island from Ireland. My grandfather was a trucker and a mechanic, and my grandmother was a homemaker and a mother to 8 very boisterous children. My father was the youngest son of 5 children from a Mexican family, and he came here undocumented from Mexico across the border, and both of my families came here seeking a better life. And regardless of their similarities, when my mother came home to her family and announced that she was marrying a Mexican man who spoke little to no English and was undocumented in 1972, needless to say, it didn't go over well. Her oldest sister, in what she would later describe to me as an effort to, quote, save my mother from herself, reported my father to immigration. And at this time, that was something that you could do. You could call the immigration office and give a name, and they would go find someone. And so they came to his work, they called him down to the manager's office, and they took my father into custody. My mother, getting the phone call, took all the money that she had been saving for their wedding, bailed him out of detention. They ran together to the courthouse and had a rushed courthouse wedding before his next court date. And he was allowed to stay. I was born into this family 6 years later, and that divide never went away. So I spent most of my young life trying to understand how to navigate between these two realities, these two worlds. An Irish family that was deeply proud of its Irish roots, and a Mexican family that was actually absent from my life. And so as I got older, and I was really lost, I was truly lost in a lot of darkness, and I was searching for light, and it found me at the US-Mexican border on a social justice trip with an interfaith group. And it was on this trip that I began to learn about ideas of social justice. I went to the US-Mexican border, and what I saw there fundamentally changed me for the rest of my life. We went there to study the convergence between immigration and global economic policy, and I really didn't understand what that meant. But what I learned there was that we live in a system built on resource extraction and human exploitation that respects no borders, no countries, and definitely no system of human rights or environmental sustainability. What I learned drove me to return home, and honestly, when I came home, I wanted to stand on the roof of my car and yell, "Do you know what's happening?" I couldn't believe what I was seeing there. But I think that the other thing that truly affected me was how complicit my lifestyle was in what was happening on that border. That my people, my community, my roots were part of this system that depended on their exploitation. That was my starting point. I came back and I decided that I had figured it out. I was 22 and I knew what needed to be done. And what needed to be done was that we needed to change the law. Surely, if we changed the law, we could change the world, but I didn't know how to do that. I had never understood how a bill became a law. In fact, I had never voted. I didn't read newspapers. So I decided to study it, which brought me to North Carolina. In North Carolina, I began studying my master's in social work with an emphasis on global economic policy and immigration policy. And at the ripe age of 23, I registered as a lobbyist at the North Carolina General Assembly. And I had no idea what I was doing. But I bought a suit, and I learned the language, and I learned some basics of how a bill became a law. And I started to get involved in this way. And what I started to learn was what it meant to talk about being a part of a broken immigration system. North Carolina had just recently been announced as the fastest growing Latino state in the nation. But let me just break it to you that when you have 10 Latinos in the state and then you have 100 Latinos in the state, that is exponential growth. And so living in North Carolina as a Latina still meant that people would compliment me on how good I spoke English, and where was I born, and then where were my parents born, and then where were their parents born before they felt settled that I was where I belonged. Needless to say, in that work, I began to understand that the way we were having our conversation about a broken immigration system was actually severely misguided. And I will say that some 20 years later, we are still having the same conversation about our broken immigration system, a conversation that is severely misguided, and I would also say incredibly narrow in its scope. So the first thing that I would say is that when we talk about a broken immigration system, we tend to have this conversation that is beginning and ending at borders. And what I'm here to tell you is that this conversation does not begin or end at the border. And in fact, in order to understand what's happening with immigration, we have to understand the entirety of how this nation was built. And I hope that you don't find this overly offensive when I say to you that what I've learned is that this nation was built on a system of enslavement and genocide. And it is this enslavement and genocide which laid the foundation for this immigration system. And so in order for us to understand what is happening with immigration, we have to understand what's happening with structural racism. And so we have to understand this in its entirety to be able to have the fullness of this conversation. I'm so glad that the room didn't blow up when I said that. So when we have this conversation right now, we tend to have this conversation about borders and the undocumented, the illegally present people that are here. And what I'm here to tell you is that one of the things that I learned at the border was that our entire economy has depended on this exploitation of people and extraction of resources. But what's happened now is that rather than just focus that on a US-based conversation, we must now be having a global conversation about how this system is working. And so in order to understand that, we have to talk about global economic policies, which truly are the driving forces behind the mass migration of people from the southern hemispheres to the northern hemispheres. This is not a conversation just about Mexico. This is not a conversation just about Latin America. This has to be a global conversation. We live in a scenario where corporations have essentially created a race to the bottom dynamic, whereby they go into a nation state, they lend it money, and then as a part of lending them that money, they require them to sign what's called a structural adjustment plan. These structural adjustment plans require nation-state governments to eliminate their human rights protections, to privatize all their social service benefits, to prioritize the needs of industry and corporations, and to do this in a way that basically exposes their people to exploitation, to marginalization, all in the name of protecting these corporations and advancing their bottom lines. As soon as the people organize, and that's what people do, it's what people have always done under incredible oppression, people organize. But what happens now is that they send the factory manager out and they announce to the people, it's really great that you're organizing, truly great, But what we've realized is that you're fighting to get $2.50 an hour, but we just found out that in Sri Lanka, they'll work for $1.50 an hour. We just found out that in Venezuela, they'll work for 50 cents an hour. We just found out. And so they just nation hop from one place in the world to the next, forcing countries to drive down their worker protections, eliminate their environmental protections, and violate their own people. If we want to have a conversation about how our immigration system is broken, we need to be having that conversation about how our immigration system is broken. In North Carolina, as in many places around the country, we have been witnessing and being in community with family and friends who have been displaced from their countries, who have been forced to migrate. Some people come to this country because they want to come to this country. And some people come to this country because they don't have a choice. And they come to this country in ways that are only available to them because the other way that our immigration system is broken is that there are not honestly enough legal pathways for people to enter this country legally. No border wall is going to fix the application backlog in our immigration system. No border wall or amount of militarization is going to fix the fact that U.S. citizens who are applying for their spouses and their children from Mexico to come into the country legally, that they are currently processing applications from 1995. For legal permanent residents who are applying for their spouses and minor children in the Philippines, they're processing applications from 2005. And when you're talking about family members trying to reunite with their family members, living in scenarios where they don't have access to the basic necessities of life, people do what they need to do in order to survive, in order to be with their families. And what that means is that we have 11 to 21 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States today. And somehow, our narrative has been that it is their fault, while we go to Old Navy and celebrate the fact that we can buy cheap shoes and cheap clothes and cheap strawberries, and then we wonder why people can't survive on the wages that are required in order to facilitate our hyper-consumerism. So in North Carolina, the fastest growing Latino state, we have a significant number of undocumented people in our community. And so we knew that in January of 2 years ago, they announced that they were going to be targeting unaccompanied minors from Central America. And we had a significant number of such minors in North Carolina. And we began building what was coming to be known as the sanctuary movement in North Carolina. We wanted our sanctuary movement to be intersectional because we understood through our analysis that sanctuary could not just be about undocumented immigrants, that our sanctuary also needed to be a place that defended folks in the Black community, that defended folks in the transgender and LGBT community. We understand that the same systems that were incarcerating and making money off of the detention of our families were also making money off of the incarceration and detention of Black families. And our partners in this work were not just members of organizations that were working in the Black community and in the Latinx community and in the LGBTQ community, but they were also members of the faith community. Because what we learned was that sanctuary was protected in faith institutions, that immigration and customs enforcement is not allowed to enter 3 special locations: schools, hospitals, and faith institutions. And so we knew that we had a place inside of churches and synagogues and mosques where if people needed protection from the threat of deportation, they could find that sanctuary within a faith institution. At the same time, we also understood that we needed to create new ways of defending our communities that did not involve calling local law enforcement, because local law enforcement were not serving our communities. And in fact, in many cases, were outright hurting our communities, and they were also collaborating with immigration and customs enforcement in the detention of our communities. And so we created what was a verification system, an alert hotline, a public service where people could let us know when something was happening in terms of immigration presence and they could alert the hotline, and we had trained verifiers that would go out to see if it was actually immigration that was actually active in our communities. And for a long time, it was occasionally a driver's license checkpoint. Sometimes it was the U.S. Forest Service, really. And we would go out and we would verify. And then early one April morning, my phone started beeping and binging and dinging, and I looked, it was really early, and there was an alert that in our neighborhood, where most of our friends and family were living, that there had been ICE sightings. So we all arrived in the parking lot outside of Nuestro Centro, and it was in fact true. There were 13 active ICE vehicles in our community, and they were on an operation that by the end of it lasted 7 days. And for 7 days, we followed them. We walked up to their windows and asked, what are you doing in this neighborhood? We alerted people, and for 7 days, they drove from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood, picking up people, and what we came to say, disappearing people. By the end, they took 26 people out of our community. By the end, people were not leaving their homes, they were not taking their children to school, and we began to realize that people were locked in their homes and not leaving, and they were running out of food. And so another faith institution called Beloved House began a food drive, and they started packing food and collecting food and delivering it to homes, just leaving it on the front doorsteps. We started printing out butterfly images to put on our cars so people would know that our cars were safe, and we would drive food into the neighborhood so that they wouldn't be afraid. At the end of that week, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Sheriff's Department and local law enforcement had a celebratory picnic at the park in the community where they had just taken 26 people. They did. And if I can tell you how ancient a devil that is, to take people, to damage communities, and then to celebrate with a barbecue. They did. They had an American flag cake, and they had a catered barbecue, and we said, well, we're gonna come to the party, and we did. We came to the party with a marching band and mariachis and smudge sticks, and we chased them out of there within 35 minutes. There is a mural painted on a wall of a retrofit Walmart in Texas that is now holding refugee children in a detention center separated from their parents. It is a picture of the president, and it says, quote, "Sometimes when you are losing the battle, you need to find a new way to win the war." Our children walk by it every day as they wonder when they will ever see and if they will ever see their parents again. There is so much to say about all of this, and yet words are so deeply insufficient. But I know that there can be no settling in silence or paralyzed despair, because we carry with us a deep knowing that this has always been happening and continues to happen to indigenous children, to black children, to undocumented children, to refugee children, and that only knowing the brutal history of this country and genocide and enslavement can we fully grasp the sense of its full potential when we don't act. And always in history, there were the helpers, the light workers, the healers, the defenders, and we find each other. And just when the overwhelming collapse of despair and darkness abounds, there is a flicker and enough light to take the next step, to share another meal sitting around flip charts of how we're going to take care of our community this week, to hold another sweet-smelling baby at the meeting while their mom talks to immigration attorneys about how to get their husband out of detention, to laugh at each other as the volunteer acupuncturists chase us around, trying to convince us not to run around the office with acupuncture needles dangling out of our ears. And we fight another day, and we light another day. I tell you that choosing hope in times of despair is not just a self-serving act, but it is actually a radical act of solidarity and resilience. Because it is only when we do that, when we bring that light, that we shine enough for our community to take even one more step. Jonathan Lear says, what makes hope radical is that it is directed toward a future goodness that transcends our ability to understand what is. Radical hope is not something you have, but it is something you practice. We are committed to the practice of radical hope, even in these times of such darkness and despair. And these are times of darkness and despair, but these are not the first time. For centuries upon centuries, our ancestors have faced this darkness and despair, and they sing, and they pray, and they love babies, and they fall in love, and they celebrate, and they make medicine, and they make magic. And I am so grateful to be in that community, and I'm so grateful to have been invited into yours. Thank you.